Then I thought, Karian, we might hear from you with a sort of cross South Africa at least, possibly across Southern Africa perspective on the scale of the issue. Then Michael would perhaps come to you for the response of a big tourism company, and then come to Chris from the Vineyard to talk about your perspective as a small operator of a lodge and what you're able to do to cope with climate change. Let me just make one thing really clear to everybody. In the top 11 countries threatened by water shortages, we all know Cape Town had a problem in 2018. The problem is not unique to Cape Town or, for that matter, to the developing world. London is on that top 11 list. And if I might say so, Gussain, I don't think London is doing as well as you are in dealing with it. So let's just be very clear that it's not just a problem in Africa. This is a global problem. And in fact, Sao Paulo had a much bigger problem even than Cape Town. Sao Paulo went down to 3% in its reservoirs. So let's just remember that this is a global problem. It's not just a Cape problem. But Gussain, perhaps if you would start us off, that would be great. Have you been given the clicker? You're about to be given it now. It's the green button for forward and red for back. Thanks, Gussain. Your mic should be on.
Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Go.
Well, thanks, Harold, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I think from my side, I've got a bit of the boring side of climate change, which is predominantly around policy development, but somebody's got to do that job. And climate change in the Western Cape is not new. You know, we've actually had a policy that goes back to 2008, where we realized that the Western Cape would be impacted by climate change. And in the first sort of more structured policy that was linked to a little bit of implementation was developed in 2014, and this was endorsed by Cabinet. And it's, to be honest, it's not an easy task, and we constantly learning and feeling our way. And something that I want to share with you today, and that Harold just touched on now in the introduction, how Cape Town and the Western Cape averted day zero, and that is by pulling together. You know, it's about openness, it's about transparency, it's about communication, effective communication, and then using all resources that is available to us, putting together and then actually trying to address the task at hand, and that was averting day zero. So I'm from the Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning, and that doesn't help us either, because environmental issues are generally seen as a stepchild when it comes to, or competing with socio-economic agendas. So, but the Western Cape government does have something known as a transversal management system, there where issues that are transversal in nature gets escalated, and each and every department then has a responsibility to contribute to achieving those objectives. But again, it's easier said than done. So just where we take our lead from, the IPCC's assessment report 6, and especially for decision makers, you know, it's, when it comes to climate change, we generally speak in the global context, but for decision makers, we want to know what's happening either within my jurisdiction, or my municipality, my district municipality, my province. So this is what my team took away from assessment report 6. And if you look at the West Coast on the left-hand side there, and the two main drivers of climate change that we try and address here is around droughts, or increased temperature, and then precipitation or rainfall. We've actually just recently, as part of our Smart Agri, which is a sectoral response strategy, employed the Climate Systems Analysis Group at UCT to model climate economic zones linked to agriculture. So this kind of verifies what AR6 did, which is a year-old report. So that's hot off the press. It's actually going to be released quite shortly. We've just entered the new financial year of our provincial government. So as you can see there, for the West Coast and throughout the Western Cape, the percentage increase compared to 1995, the likelihood of droughts will increase from, let's say, there's 11% in the Garden Route, 13% in the Central Karoo, 28% around the Cape Winelands, and 21% on the West Coast. So that's the kind of information that our decision makers want to have, how they can, what they're needing to do to respond to climate change, so that we're still pushing economic development despite the complexity that we are needing to deal with. The second one, very importantly, and that links directly to the day zero, is around decreased rainfall. So across the board, again, it's not very large percentages, but if you link that to increased temperature, and as far as I'm aware, this has not been calculated, is precipitation. So the hotter the region gets, the more the increased likelihood of evaporative water loss. And then something that's a little bit, well, we don't know what the impacts of these are going to be, but the predictions are that there's going to be increased likelihood of extreme hot days. So both our extreme temperatures are going to be increasing. And this is basically what we're trying to do. There is complexity, but we're trying to break it down and make it palatable for the decision makers. So they say a picture says 1,000 words. This is what we've experienced in the Western Cape. People always say that we've lived it here in this province. You see the top left picture, flooding, there's sea level rise, we're a coastal province. The bottom left, those who know the Knysna, that we've had massive fires in Knysna, people were displaced. It was really a major catastrophe, and people are still struggling to build back. So livelihoods have been seriously affected. And in the top right there is something that we're still working with our health sector on, is that, with increased temperatures, these sort of flooding episodes, so even though, what I forgot to mention was that even though rainfall will go down, the intensity of these episodes are going to be increased. So, and this may make things conducive for malaria to actually reach our province. So that is again something that I suppose not just for the health sector, but for the tourism sector as well. I suppose people shy away from coming to regions potentially. So what I would like to share with you today, this is also, we just completed it at the end of March, is the Western Cape Climate Change Response Strategy Vision 2050. And what this strategy does, so this is the one that follows on from the 2014 version, is that we're actually taking this urgency around climate change into consideration. I think there's been a lot of, where people just push it to the back of their minds because it's viewed as a long-term issue, and because we are so closely linked to the political time frame. Our politicians just want to know what's going to happen within this next 5 years when they are in office. So it is a big challenge, and that's so what we're trying to do differently is to respond to the urgency that to the global urgency. Again, you must have heard, if you are familiar with the space, that the milestone deadlines that people are looking at is 2050. So what I'll come to the vision slightly shorter. And associated with this strategy is the development of an implementation framework that will commence this financial year, which will have 5-year incremental horizons. And then very importantly is that this is a guiding document for all sector stakeholders in this province. It's also novel in the fact that it's not a strategy or policy that has been drafted by government for government. we've had, the term that we've used, it's been co-created with as many stakeholders as possible. Again, a challenge is getting those stakeholders in the room. So it's, yeah. What we say is we work with the ones to work with us. So that brings me to the vision that we've got, which is to be net zero and climate resilient by 2050. And for those of you who know the South African context, that is an extremely tall ask, because our electricity generation is predominantly coal-based, and it's not in this region. But we cannot divorce ourselves from the network. We have got a single network run by Eskom, and so we cannot divorce ourselves, as I said, from that. So the way in which we're going to tackle or try and achieve this vision is with 4 guiding objectives. The first one is responding to the emergency. The second one speaks predominantly to a mitigation program. The third one is our adaptation program or resilience. And then the fourth one is around having a just transition through public sector, private sector, and civil society collaboration. And that is the what's key, is to get all those stakeholders on board. Each and everyone has a role to play. Government is not going to pull this off alone, and we've realized that, and that was where we're kind of extending the hand so that people can come in and contribute. This is what we've deemed the climate action pathways to us achieving net zero as well as climate resilience by 2050. The first milestone by 2025 is to get all sectors on board, and by 2030, which is what the annual the IPCC AR6 report says, that if we don't turn the ship around by 2030, then we may as well pack up and go and rest on the beach until things just fall flat. And then it is the critical time period between 2030 and 2050 where we actually ramp up our responses so that we can meet those global deadlines. So again, those of you who follow the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions that were submitted at last year's COP, was not sufficient to allow us to keep to that global average increase of 1.5 degree. So there's a lot more work at a political level to drive the contributions that is required. Harold, I'm going to stop there. The next few slides is about what the sector can contribute, but I think that we'll have in the discussion, and my fellow panelists will probably touch on those as well. Thanks.
Time somebody describes this to me, I get depressed again. I mean, the challenge is simply enormous, and you made the point at the beginning of your presentation that part of the problem here is that the people who are going to win the next election, wherever in the world, won't be in power in 2050. It's that opportunity to try and get people to see beyond that 4 or 5 year electoral horizon is a really big challenge. And we're going to come back, I think, to that with you, Michael, when we look at the business perspective, which may be a bit different, particularly a family-owned business. But first, Karen, can we come to you and ask for your reflections on the situation as you see it in Southern Africa more generally, or however you want to do this? But you operate with a number of different businesses and governments. So it'd be very interesting to have that perspective. You're saying thank you very much for that. It's inevitably going to be a bit depressing, whatever you talk about. It goes with your job. Karen, cheer us up.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Thank you very much for that insightful presentation around what's happening in Cape Town and a very kind of practical localization of what climate change means. Harold, to your point, I followed COP26 quite closely, and one of my favorite speakers during the event was the Prime Minister of Barbados. She didn't mince her word in any of the panels or at any of the sessions where she was. And she said that, making these decisions for 2050, that's not for the leaders of 2050 to make those decisions. That's the leaders of today that needs to make those decisions. And that's something that came across through the COP26 discussions quite strongly, is that there's this mammoth task to be taken up. It's not unachievable, but it's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of collaboration, and some trade-offs. And the quicker we're able to get around the table, the quicker we're able to hash some of these out. I've just got a couple of slides just to frame some of our discussion here today. I think everybody here is probably aware of the release of the latest IPCC reports. The first one looking at kind of what's driving climate change and confirming that it is in fact human activity driving climate change, the fact that it's happening much quicker than what we had anticipated. That was released last year. In addition to that, that first report found that what we thought was a safe target in terms of 1.5 degrees is in fact not as safe as what we'd hoped. And please, this isn't a doomsday discussion. This is very practical. This is talking about the science and trying to find the solutions. Because specifically in South Africa, I think the tourism sector is going to play a key role in driving climate adaptation and driving part of what we're seeing around the just energy transition. And I'll get to that. The second part of the IPCC report was released earlier this year, and this looked at vulnerabilities. And I think it didn't say anything that we didn't already know. We know that the most vulnerable groups of society, the most vulnerable countries and economies are the most hard hit by climate change. At COP26, it was reiterated that there is substantial amounts of funding being made available for climate mitigation, but climate adaptation is dragging behind in Africa by almost $350 billion US. That's why initiatives such as what Richard had spoken about around this ranking of biodiversity investment is so critically important, because it brings adaptation to the forefront. We have to start, as the city of Cape Town has started to do, we have to start looking at climate change from both a mitigation and an adaptation perspective. That is critically important for Africa. And then the third part of the assessment report was released last week. This looked at mitigation. Again, it's what we know. We're far overshooting the 1.5 degrees. We're on a very good track to reach at least a 3 degrees Celsius temperature increase. In Africa, keep in mind, Africa heats at twice the global average, so that's looking at a 6 degree temperature increase. When we move into the 2.5 degree temperature increases, we're starting to look at major economic losses and changes to the agriculture, to the nature and the biodiversity sectors. So this last report, what was very interesting is two things. For the first time, the IPCC report started talking about behavioral change as part of mitigation. That hasn't happened and come forward quite significantly up to date. There's been a lot said around reducing emissions at a large scale, looking at the energy sector, but behavioral change hasn't come to the fore quite as prominent yet. And this last report starts talking about that. In addition to that, this last report starts moving away from the narrative around population dynamics driving climate change. And it rather looks at how populations or certain segments of the population are using the economy that drives climate change. So now we're again in the realm where we're saying, Africa, for instance, emits at least 3 tons of carbon per capita per annum, whereas in America, for instance, that's 16 tons of carbon per capita per annum. So there's a definite discussion, for which I'm very thankful, around this differentiation between different economies and different contexts and what each of these contexts mean from a climate adaptation perspective. There were a few other interesting reports last year. I won't go into a lot of detail. One of them looked at the state of climate in Africa, specifically around issues related to health, issues related to large-scale migration and large-scale loss of livelihoods and economic capacities of people. Really interesting report done in terms of children from a social perspective and the interaction with climate change. And I think somebody mentioned it earlier, climate change has moved out of the realm of being an environmental issue. this is a very much an economic and a socio-economic issue, and it's impacting the way in which economic sectors relate to one another, and it's impacting the way in which we relate to these economic sectors. And then finally, there was a special report released just before COP on the intersection between climate change and health. And given the context over the past 2 years of the pandemic, I found it quite interesting that this report said that climate change is in fact the greatest health risk facing the globe today. And it is precisely because of the fact that floods, increased temperatures, warmer winters are resulting in the disbursement of disease. It's resulting in the disbursement of certain pests, certain illnesses much more rapidly and more effectively. What does all of this mean for the tourism sector? A couple of years ago, I was involved in a study that was ran by the GIZ and the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environmental Affairs, specifically looking at climate risk within the tourism sector. And we had a look at 27 different tourism sites spread out across South Africa, different types of tourism establishments, whether they be cultural, whether they be a small B&B, whether they be a larger hotel group. And some of the key findings that came out of the study related to what I wanted to share with you today was some of the concerns that these tourism operators had already started to see in terms of climate. And the first of this was the increase in temperatures. Not necessarily this kind of gradual increase to the 3 degrees that we're looking at, but prolonged periods of extensive heat, prolonged periods of heat waves, which causes some concern around travelers who are not used to that kind of climate. In addition to that, we are experiencing warmer winters. This does two things. As I said, it does, from a health perspective, there are certain concerns, but it does also change some of the biomes or some of the nature-based attractions, and that limits to some extent some of the tourism visitors. In addition, water stress, obviously what's happened in Cape Town was a prime example, but there is this constant talk around prolonged droughts, and this is something that's relevant both here as well as in sub-Saharan Africa. Rising sea levels was a concern for some of the smaller establishments around South Africa's coastline. There was a definite change in terms of landscape and, as I said, natural biomes. Bush encroachment, interestingly, was something that came out repeatedly across the provinces in terms of how this kind of alien invasives, certain types of plant or certain types of plant life encroaches on our natural biomes. It changes the landscape. It changes, for instance, in one of the areas that we looked at, it changes certain birding patterns. And this was a hotspot for people from all over the globe to come and look at specific birding species. And now all of a sudden, these had migrated or changed to a different biome or to a different area. So again, it impacts your tourism patterns and your supply. There is a change in destination image. I think in relation to this is the fact that climate change is, as I said, a socio-economic issue. So pressures experienced by communities surrounding major tourism areas has an impact on how these tourism areas are perceived by tourists. This was mentioned in some of our major wildlife parks, where poaching or the perceived threat around safety and security was mentioned repeatedly. I think there's an interesting relationship between climate change and the tourism sector. Climate change impacts both how tourists perceive a certain area or perceive a specific landmark, but climate change also perceives physical landscape change and actual landscape change or natural resources or natural opportunities. And that at the end of the day impacts your tourism sector. Very briefly, in terms of resilience, something that was mentioned in terms of Cape Town as well. If we look at adaptive capacity, some of the key aspects related to resilience within the tourism sector related to basic principles of, for instance, collaboration. We found that in a number of provinces, some of your small-scale tourism operators, some of your small-scale tourism facilities, in sharing different lessons around either enabling renewable energy or looking at unique grey water harvesting systems, just opening up those discussions among tourism operators already built some adaptive capacity. Collaboration also deals with, of course, in South Africa, we have to deal with, and specifically from a tourism sector, have to deal with major infrastructure backlogs and the impact of these infrastructure backlogs on your operations. Things like roads, the washing away of signage, the washing away of power or supply in some cases. So our suggestion in this regard was to look at very active forums within each province that could highlight these issues to the local municipalities. As I said, tourism is a major driver of economic opportunities within the South African context. It's going to become increasingly important in provinces such as Mpumalanga, such as the Northwest, where there's going to be a dramatic shift away from mining and from coal. And having established collaboration forums with, for instance, your municipalities with one another to highlight best practice, to highlight issues, or to unlock some of these opportunities might build and contribute to building adaptive capacity. There was a sector-wide awareness around climate. This was focused very much on the immediate, managing energy supply, managing grey water systems. What we did find is that there's not necessarily a recognition of climate impacts across the value chain of the tourism sector. So long-term energy supply or security around energy supply, long-term impacts on, for instance, agriculture, where you get food or goods from, long-term impact in terms of labor or labor pool areas. So this was something that we thought, if you unpack those risks, it builds resilience. In addition to that, I think very importantly, climate impacts on communities, on rural areas surrounding tourism hotspots, surrounding specific tourism areas, that will exacerbate the socioeconomic conditions within those areas. As a result, because livelihoods are vanishing, subsistence-based farming are vanishing, that'll increase poaching. Because subsistence-based livelihoods might be washed away, it could increase poaching or maintenance issues as a result of poaching on some of the tourism facilities. So really working with local communities and driving home that concept of the value of conservation, the economic value of conservation and biodiversity is critically important to build adaptive capacity. And then, of course, something that kind of pops up continuously is the need to build capacity within the decision-making body, for instance, the Department of Tourism, around climate modeling, proactive management of that modeling in relation to specific economic targets. I'm just going to finish with just recapping collaboration, vitally important to build adaptive capacity across the sector, but also with decision makers and with practical enforcers. Looking at local community integration and their resilience building to strengthen the resilience of the tourism facility, the tourism operating area. One last thing I just wanted to mention that I forgot. Climate change is not unique to specific areas. It doesn't have boundaries. So if you want to manage climate change from a tourism sector more effectively, that needs to happen on a regional basis. That's incredibly important. Bush encroachment, changing landscapes, changing fauna and flora patterns have to be dealt with on a regional perspective. Luckily, I've got that in my concluding notes. And then infrastructure maintenance. Kind of reactive responses to infrastructure maintenance, however easy that might seem, it's no longer business as usual. There needs to be a different way in which we look at infrastructure maintenance from a security of supplies perspective. Grey water harvesting, looking at alternative forms of energy, looking at ways and means to support, for instance, municipal decision makers in managing infrastructure maintenance. That'll be key in how we manage this as a sector.
Carrie-Anne, thank you very much for that. I mean, what is clear is that the agenda is massive and it's urgent. And the problem with those kinds of agendas is often people just go back to bed and give up. So, Michael, Cullinan Group, a big employer, a big sense of Michael, a big sense of responsibility within the Cullinan Group and the Tolman Travel Corporation. tell us what you think you can do, because at least you don't have to operate with a 4 or 5 year time perspective. You can take a longer view, which makes the businesses a lot different from those people who are constantly chasing re-election. I'm sure Ghassan would like to have people running the city who are going to still be in office in 2050, but your sons and daughters, people who work in the business with you now, will still be there in 2050. So what are you doing? If you would mind telling us, that would be great.
Thank you. Harold, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, firstly, listening to my colleagues set it all out and having, with everybody here, emerge from a crisis that we faced in the last 2 years. As a group, the last thing we want to do is move into another crisis. And it certainly looks like if we don't do something very serious about it, we're going to be. And so as a group, we have a responsibility, a travel company and a travel group. We're a global group and also a South African group. And if we don't move very quickly here and set an example, thank you. Then we are not playing our bit, which we need to do. And I think it's incumbent upon leading companies to give the lead and to share with our sector. I during the past 18 months, sat on a panel discussing policy to our Minister of Tourism, and a key policy that I hope will prevail as a result of those meetings is very much working with government and our sector on the various challenges that we face in our sector, particularly in South Africa, and this is clearly one of them. As a company and as a group, we started, because it really is a journey, we started it in 2008, and I have seen us speed up with the more alarming information that is coming out. I've seen our efforts speed up at a dramatic rate. We started when our chairman, my uncle Stanley Tolman, who's our founder of the Travel Corporation, and his son is Brett Tolman, who's the CEO, came up with the idea of establishing a foundation, which is called Tread Right, and it focuses on conservation, on communities, helping communities wherever we travel, and sustainability. And during that course, we've been through and done a lot of work over many things, single-use plastics and cleaning up beaches. And in all those categories, we've normally had about 50 projects happening throughout the world at any one time. We now are at carbon zero as our objective and our policy. But not very long ago, we were carbon neutral as our policy. That was a plan for 2025. We've now moved past that plan to how do we attain carbon zero as a policy. Some key things, because I know I was told 5 minutes, so just some key things that I think are important. Leadership, I think that's critical. It comes from our family. It's flown down into the organization. And the people who run it, this side of our business, we have an amazing team who do focus totally on sustainability globally. We have a sustainability officer in our South African businesses, and they help all of our companies to develop where we want to go to and to develop a plan. Key, I think, is measurement. If you're not measuring, you actually don't know what your footprint is, and you don't know what you want to achieve. So we have been doing that, and our first results will come out this year. We're measuring in South Africa everything we own, so our buildings, our coaches, and our trips. On buildings, we look at electricity. That is something without this plan we did about 4 years ago. We brought in solar into all of our buildings. It was hugely successful. We just did it more as a feel-good. This is a good idea. Now it's part of a plan that is critical. So we're going back and saying, where do we not have solar, in which of our areas of our business throughout South Africa? And we are looking at that, or looking at where we can increase our solar input. Government, as I said, on the government side, we have quite an extended coach fleet, about 500 vehicles in South Africa, mostly coaches, but also vehicles. And we have looked at moving our fleet into something that was carbon free, but at the moment the infrastructure is not there. And that has to be part of our discussions, working with government, with, I think, our many other challenges. And I'm hoping that if we can build on those challenges all together and work together as a sector and with government, and we can make some progress there. On our trips, our hotels, we've done the same thing. These are things we've already done that we would have worked on, how to reduce your wastage, how to be more efficient. All of those things have been part of our journey of going to carbon neutrality. We have financed things that are carbon removal projects. We've got 2 on the go at the moment. One is a seaweed, and using seaweed to chop it up and put it in the soil as a way of storing carbons. Another one is crushing, it's like a volcanic rock, and you crush it and you put it on the beaches and it takes in carbon. So carbon removal is something we are supporting at the moment, and these concepts require support to get off the ground. So we're busy with them at the moment to prove it, because if we can prove it, you can roll it out in a much bigger fashion. Carbon set-offs we're looking to as part of our trips, but it's a very much transition period, carbon set-offs, because you're not really doing anything, you're buying them in. So we really want to focus on carbon zero. And I think that once we get our measurements, that will give us the tools that we need to assess where we are. And with the leadership of a company or a group, and with other companies, and sharing that information, I think that we're on the path that we need to be on, and we can then evolve, which is really the last point from our perspective, and that is how can we learn from each other companies in our sector, and also groups that are experts on these areas. And that's where we have a wonderful team that focus on these type of things. We also collaborate in our sector, and I'm hoping that with that we will evolve. We will share our learnings and others will share with us. Because if we don't do it all together, we can see what's going to happen here. So,
Michael, thank you very much indeed for that. If I could just add a couple of things that I've been told. I don't think they're confidential. I mean, the first is that I'm talking with Shannon about the possibility of having a big part of World Travel Market in London in November focused on your science-based targets, because you're one of the first major tourism companies, and certainly you'll be the biggest, to go over to science-based targets. It's really exciting. And the other thing is that clearly the whole TreadRight Foundation is committed to transparency, which brings me back to what I was talking about earlier in here about the platform for change, and wanting to use that platform to enable the solutions that you find through the TreadRight Foundation and through your own work within the company, to spread those so that people can copy them and use them, and then that way we accelerate the change that's necessary.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. They do an amazing team, Shannon and her team. And measuring is one thing, but it's actually reporting on it, that everybody can see it. And our first reports will come out this year in the third quarter.
They'll be just in time for November and WTM London. So
yeah.
I'm very excited by that. Thanks very much indeed, Michael.
Thank you.
Chris, you're at the other end of the travel industry in a way. I mean, you're running a very successful lodge, the Vineyard. How do you see your contribution to doing something about this dreadful graph?
Okay, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the practical things that we can really implement. I was speaking to a maintenance manager the other day from a small hotel in Cape Town, and I was actually quite horrified to find out that they're still using elements to heat the hot water in their building. I think we moved to heat pumps about 15 years ago. So there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of intervention that can be done to make us more efficient. Some of the other things, for example, should new hotels or anything in the hospitality industry, have a big part to play. Should it not all be designed according to Green Star, green building standards? So it's as efficient as possible, as small as possible, an impact on the environment. Should we not embrace renewable energy better than we are at the moment? I mean, when we moved to renewables in 2015, they're twice as efficient now. So there's no reason why you shouldn't be moving in that direction. Something else, controls in rooms. They're getting a lot more efficient and easy to implement. You don't have to put in wires. They can be wireless and control the heating and the cooling of the rooms. I mean, we want to be luxury, so you want to preheat rooms, want to pre-cool rooms in certain cases, but you don't want it to be standing like that the whole day, because the housekeeper was there at 8 o'clock in the morning and the guest was only arriving at 5 o'clock in the evening, for example. When they get to the front desk, it should switch on, cool the room. It's at the right temperature when the guest gets there. I think guests also have a role to play. So contributing to offsetting their night stay, the carbon footprint of their night stay. Even better would be if the hotel matches that, so they can see that that's not a one-sided scenario. And then something else which is maybe a little bit controversial is looking at, sometimes in hospitality we tend to decide what we think the guests want. So it's something that always bothers me is around, do we really need to have a bath in a luxury room? Can it not be a luxurious shower? Is it really critical? And will you lose business if you don't have a bath? That's something that always worries me. And just talking about risk and so on, I stay close to the False Bay coast, and my insurance company has already stopped insuring me because I'm too much of a risk due to sea level rise. I think they could have handled it a bit better, because they didn't have an option. You either didn't get the insurance or you took the risk. They could potentially rather have allowed you to pay a premium increase and use that for some sort of intervention, be it solar panels installed somewhere or something else, which I think would have been a much better way, instead of just chasing me away and moving to another company. It's just some things to think of.
Thanks very much indeed, Chris. I think we have a couple of questions, if there are any. The gentleman here, can we?
Hi there, thank you. I just wanted to ask, a lot of problems seem to be that people are willing to go solar or willing to adapt their houses and get off the grid. But obviously there's a cost factor. I mean, if you do that, you're talking 50 or 100K. Is anything being done to try and fast track the manufacturing or whatever of solar items, or have some plan that we can get the average Joe like me that can afford it and everybody else, so that we can actually achieve our targets quicker in terms of of getting off the grid and so on?
Hussein, I think thank you. Hussein, I think that's one for you.
Yeah, from a government perspective, there's definitely things happening. There's good and bad news. It depends on how people appreciate what they're going through. So, for example, not on PV, but let's say solar water heating. It's a no-brainer. South Africa has got fantastic solar radiation. Each and every household should, in actual fact, have a solar water heater on it. It doesn't make sense, for us to create power in Mpumalanga, put it in the grid, and it travels down. There's losses all the way down. You open up it goes to it powers your geyser, increases temperature, and then you open the cold water and you cool that hot water down. There's just so much inefficiency in doing it that way. Solar PV, we are striving, or we've made through our economic development strategy, we've made it known that we want to be the green economic hub. The Premier is totally supportive of that. The Saldanha SEZ, it's a region that we are wanting to promote green technology, and PV sits squarely in that domain. So hopefully we'll be attracting some more manufacturers to the Western Cape, and then it will drive manufacture, and hopefully also then drive, once there's good demand, it will drive pricing down as well. So definitely on the cards.
Yes, I do. Thank you for the information and the efforts. There's clearly been a lot of work being done and still being done and still to be done. I am curious about how Cape Town, South Africa, as a city, can leverage this experience to kind of, either meet the demands of international goals like the SDGs and surpass them, and also kind of put itself, again, like it did with the World Cup, like it did with the water shortage, as a city that is able to manage these kinds of crises. And, crisis-fueled collaboration is a thing, and if Cape Town is able to use it, can it teach other cities to use it?
Hussein, I fear it's another one for you.
Yeah, fantastic question. And I think I said it earlier when I presented, it's about collaboration. The city can do one thing. Yes, we managed to pull through the day zero water crisis. We learned a lot. We didn't do things perfectly, by no means, and I think a lot of that wasn't communicated. I think where we went wrong was, I think, where we were pitching the communication at. You don't go into the township, the guys using the least amount of water, and tell them to even reduce further. It is more your middle and upper class, the ones with swimming pools, manicured gardens that are just running there. They got very, very high water bills. So I think we went there because that put a sour taste in a lot of citizens' mouths, and we shouldn't make that same mistake again. But if I actually post that I managed to go to the US, and I shared our experience with them there. And California, also a Mediterranean country, we managed to have some sort of twinning agreement where we could learn from their experiences. And when we shared the figures that we needed to have reduced our daily consumption by, they were flabbergasted. And that, as I said, it's about openness, transparency. This is what we are faced with. This is where we need to be, and everybody contributed. And if you look at who saved, again, if the city hadn't had friends outside of their boundaries, we would have experienced day zero. So it's actually farmers in neighboring smaller municipalities that came to the rescue of the city. So they allowed water to be released from their private and other municipal dams into the city supply system. So that is again, so it's about everybody pulling together. I mean, in the climate change space, you know, if your neighbor's not doing well, then you certainly aren't doing well. As my colleague said, you know, climate change doesn't hold any boundaries. So
Shane, I think that's a really important point to make and to close the panel with, because that sense that the only way we as a species are going to get through this is by social solidarity. Nobody's going to get through this on their own. There is no individual who can solve this problem. It has to be a collective, collaborative response. Could I ask you to thank the panel, Karian, Gusain, Michael and Chris? It's been a slightly depressing panel, but it was good to hear from the private sector talking about what they can do, as well as from the public sector and from the consultants spelling out the scale of the problem. And I apologize for the graph that I had put up, but the reality is that we have not dented our emissions of greenhouse gases at all, and we've known about it for 40 years. So we really do need to speed up. But thank you very much indeed. Thank you.